Well, good day, everybody, and welcome to the personality edition of 5-Minute Psych. In this 5-minute segment, we'll look at the psychodynamic perspective of personality, beginning with a look at the 3 structures of personality. Then we'll discuss defense mechanisms and consider 6 examples before ending with an evaluation of the psychodynamic theory. Sigmund Freud, the founder of the psychodynamic perspective, said that the unconscious exerted a great influence on behavior. He argued that personality is the outward expression of how 3 theoretical structures of personality interact: the id, ego, and superego. The id is the innermost core of personality, and it seeks immediate gratification of whatever it wants, whether this is possible or not, and it functions irrationally, operating according to the pleasure principle. But on its own, the id can't fulfill these wants, so the ego develops, and unfortunately has to listen to the id like a constant whine. Get me this, do that now. The ego tries within the boundaries of reality to satisfy the id. The last to develop is the superego, and this is the child's internal moral compass that develops as the parents are teaching them about right and wrong. Most importantly, the superego doesn't agree with anything the id wants and quickly becomes another constant voice in the ego's ear about what should and shouldn't be done and when. The ego is essentially stuck in the middle and tries as best as it can to satisfy the id while keeping the superego happy. The observable effect of this compromise is what we call personality. Sometimes the id wants something that the ego can't satisfy, and when this happens, it causes a lot of anxiety for the ego. The id doesn't understand that the ego can't do that, and it persists on having that want gratified. At first, the ego tries realistic strategies. So suppose you're angry at your boss and your id wants you to go scream at them, but your ego knows you can't. So instead, you try a realistic strategy to deal with the anger, maybe having a rational discussion with your boss. But if that still doesn't work, then the ego turns to defense mechanisms, which operate unconsciously to distort reality. Basically, the defense mechanisms allow the ego to release the impulses of the id, but to do so in a disguised form that doesn't upset the superego. Of course, the person is completely unaware that they're lying to themselves in order to make their universe work, and Freud said that too much reliance on this is what causes pathology. Here are some examples of defense mechanisms. Repression, when the wants of the id remain unconscious. For example, you develop amnesia for the big argument you had with your boss. Sublimation, when the wants of the id are presented in a socially desired way. So you take those impulses to lash out at your boss, and instead you join a debate team and argue to win for your team. Denial is when you refuse to acknowledge the situation. For example, you refuse to believe that you had a big argument with your boss, and you insist it was just a little tiff. Displacement is when you take the impulse of the id and put it on a safe target. So you take the angry impulse from being in an argument with your boss, and then when you get home, you yell at your neighbor. Projection is when the bad impulse is put on someone else. So for example, you have an impulse to yell at your boss, but you hide this from yourself and instead believe that your boss has an impulse to be aggressive toward you. And finally, rationalization is when you come up with reasonable excuses for the bad impulses. So after you yell at your boss, you think it was okay to do because your boss yells at people all the time. As a theory of personality, many of Freud's ideas have inadequate evidence. First, Freud used a small, limited sample to develop his theory using the case study method. Second, his theory is untestable by scientific methods, since no clear behavioral predictions can be generated. For instance, if you predict that Group 1 will score higher than Group 2, but you find the opposite, is it because the theory is wrong, or was a defense mechanism at play? You'd have no way of knowing. Also, Freud's ideas about unconscious processes are very different from how we think of the unconscious today. We don't see it as a place full of bad impulses of the id, but instead as a way of processing information automatically and without effort. Like when we do dishes. Likely we're not thinking about the dishes when we wash them, right? It's all automatic or done unconsciously, and this is currently how we think of the unconscious. On the positive side, the psychodynamic perspective attempts to explain why we have the personality that we do. It also emphasizes the importance of early experiences and how these can and do influence personality development. Well, we just looked at the psychodynamic perspective of personality, and we focused on 3 structures of personality before turning to defense mechanisms and 6 examples of them. Finally, we evaluated the psychodynamic theory. Now, aren't you glad you had 5 minutes?